The fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows across the study walls of Garrett Ranch. Outside, December snow fell thick and silent over Wyoming, blanketing the land in white that seemed to stretch forever. Inside, warmth gathered around two figures, seated near the flames. Grace Garrett sat in the leather chair that had once belonged to her father, though calling him that still felt strange even after 30 years. At 60 years old, her hair had gone silver, but her eyes remained sharp, the same fierce gray that had stared down corrupt reverends and courtroom judges. Her hands, weathered from years of legal work and ranch living, cradled a cup of tea that had gone cold. Across from her, William Garrett shifted in his seat, 17 years old tall, like his father, Billy, but with the same nervous energy that had once plagued his Uncle Jamie. The boy stared into the fire, his packed trunk visible in the hallway beyond, ready for the morning train to Boston. To law school, to a future that terrified him. "Grandmother," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "I'm scared." Grace studied her grandson over the rim of her teacup. She saw herself in him, that same fear dressed up as doubt, that same strength trying to break through uncertainty. "What frightens you?" "That I'm not strong enough, that I'll fail, that I'll disappoint the family." The words hung in the warm air between them. From somewhere deeper in the house came the sound of Henry, moving, about 70 years old now, but still restless, still unable to sit still, when snow fell and memories stirred. Grace set down her teacup with deliberate care. "Let me tell you a story, Will, about a 10-year-old girl standing on an auction platform in the snow with 4 children and not a penny to her name." She leaned forward, firelight catching the lines of her face, each one a map of survival. "That was the day I learned that strength isn't the absence of fear. Strength is doing what's right even when your heart is shaking so hard you think your ribs might crack." Will's eyes widened slightly. He had heard pieces of this story before, fragments shared at family gatherings, whispered among cousins, but never the whole truth, never from her own lips. It was February of 1872. Grace began, her voice taking on that particular quality it always did when she reached back through time. And that was the day everything changed. Wyoming Territory, February 1872. The snow fell like judgment. Grace Mitchell stood on the wooden platform in the center of town, her thin coat doing nothing against the wind that cut through fabric and skin alike. Around her, 4 children huddled close. Jamie, her 8-year-old brother, pressed against her side. Ellie Bell, 11, kept her arms around Billy Reed, who at 5 years old still cried for a mother 2 years dead. And Sarah, 6 years old, with eyes like storm clouds, watched everything in silence. Below the platform, the crowd gathered. Farmers with rough hands and calculating eyes. Shopkeepers looking for cheap labor. Families who wanted to show their Christian charity without actually opening their hearts. Grace's hands were fists at her sides. "We ain't animals," she said, and her voice carried further than a 10-year-old's voice had any right to carry. "You don't get to pick us apart like cattle." A farmer stepped forward, tobacco juice staining his beard. His hand reached for Jamie's arm fingers like iron clamps. $5 for the boys. I'll take these 2. Leave the girls." Grace moved before thinking. Her small fist connected with the man's wrist, not hard enough to hurt him, but hard enough to make him stop. Hard enough to show she meant every word that came next. "Get your hands off my brother." The farmer stumbled back, shock twisting into rage. "Why, you little—" "Touch him again and I'll break your fingers." She meant it, every word. 10 years old, barely 90 pounds, and Grace Mae Dawson would have fought every man in that Wyoming crowd if it meant keeping her family together. Behind her, Billy's wailing cut through the wind. "Mama, I want Mama." The sound drove into Grace's chest like a knife. Billy's mother had died in a tenement fire in Boston. The boy still called for her in his sleep, still didn't understand that some people don't come back no matter how hard you wish. "Shh, Billy." Ellie pulled the small boy closer, her own voice trembling. "It's okay. Grace is going to fix it." Grace wished she had Ellie's faith. Reverend Silas Crawford stepped forward, then his black coat pristine against the falling snow, his smile the kind that made skin crawl. He spread his hands like a preacher at Sunday service, which is exactly what he was. A preacher who made money placing orphans the way other men sold horses. "Now, Grace Mae," he said, his voice dripping false sweetness, "we've discussed this behavior before. We stayed together, Grace said. All five of us. That's not negotiable. I'm afraid that's not how this works, child. You're orphans. You go where you're placed. Then place us together or don't place us at all. Crawford's smile tightened. He turned to the crowd, his voice taking on that performative quality of a man used to commanding attention. As you can see, the girl has spirit, misguided of course. These children aren't actually siblings, just strays who traveled on the same train. There's no reason they need to remain together. We're family, Grace said. You're nothing. Crawford's voice dropped, the pastoral sweetness evaporating like morning frost. You're unwanted children that nobody claimed, merchandise that hasn't sold. That's what you are. The crowd stirred. The bidding began in earnest. $10 for the boys. I'll take just the oldest for field work. The blonde girl looks healthy. 15 for her. 20 for... Stop! Grace screamed it, the word tearing from her throat with all the fury of 2 years in orphanages, 2 years of being told she was lucky, 2 years of watching children disappear into placements that worked them until they broke. Stop, stop, stop. We're not for sale. We're people. We're... Crawford's hand clamped over her mouth. His fingers dug into her jaw hard enough to leave marks, hard enough to promise worse if she didn't submit. Enough! His voice was ice and iron. One more outburst, and you go in the wagon alone. Understand? Grace bit him. She tasted blood, heard. His curse felt him yank his hand back. His face contorted, not with pain, but with rage, the kind of rage men get when children dare to fight back. He raised his hand to strike her. Grace didn't flinch. She'd been hit before, by matrons at the orphanage, by prospective families who decided she was too much trouble, by men who thought children should be silent and grateful for whatever scraps they received. She braced for the blow. It never came. A hand caught Crawford's wrist mid-swing. Large callus, strong enough to stop the Reverend's arm like it was nothing at all. That's enough. Grace looked up. The man was tall, weathered by wind and sun, maybe 40 years old or maybe older. Hard to tell with snow gathering in his dark hair and shadows carved deep beneath gray eyes. He wore a rancher's coat, well made but worn, and he held Crawford's wrist with the casual grip of someone who could break it without much effort. Mr. Garrett, Crawford's voice went oily smooth. I didn't see you there. Clearly, the man Garrett released Crawford's wrist with obvious contempt. You make a habit of hitting children, Reverend. The girl bit me, drew blood. Seems like she had cause. Crawford's face reddened. These orphans are my responsibility. How I discipline them is my concern. Not anymore. The words dropped into the crowd like stones into still water. I'm sorry, Crawford blinked. I'm taking them. Garrett's gaze swept over the 5 children. All of them. Grace's breath caught. Behind her, she heard Ellie's sharp intake of air, Jamie's confused whimper, Billy's crying stuttering into hiccups. Sarah remained silent as always, but those gray eyes fixed on Garrett with an intensity that made Grace's skin prickle. Mr. Garrett, surely you're joking. Crawford forced a laugh. You taking in children, 5 of them. Do I look like I'm joking? He didn't. He looked like a man carved from the same granite as the mountains, cold and immovable, and absolutely serious. You're a bachelor, Crawford pressed. No wife, no experience with children. The placement committee would never approve. How much? I beg your pardon. How much for all 5? Name your price. The crowd had gone completely silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Crawford's expression shifted. Grace watched Greed War. With outrage, watched the Reverend calculate exactly how much he could extract from this unexpected opportunity. Well, there are fees, of course. Transportation costs, documentation. He paused, his eyes glittering. The standard placement fee is $10 per child, but given the circumstances, another pause, drawing it out. $200 for all 5. Someone in the crowd gasped. $200 was a fortune, more than most families saw in a year. Garrett reached into his coat without hesitation. He pulled out a leather wallet, counted bills with steady hands, and pressed them into Crawford's palm. 200 plus 50 for your trouble. His eyes met Crawford's with unmistakable meaning. And for any paperwork that might cause problems to disappear. Crawford's fingers closed around the money. A pleasure doing business, Mr. Garrett. It's not business. Garrett turned to Grace. It's family. He extended his hand toward her palm up an offering. Grace stared at it. "What do you want?" she demanded. "To take you somewhere warm." "Why, Beppo, because it's cold and you're shivering." "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It's not, but it's all I've got right now. Come with me and I'll explain on the way. Or stay here and let the Reverend auction you off piece by piece. Your choice, Vaughn." Grace's mind raced. This was wrong. This was a trick. Rich men didn't buy orphans out of kindness. They bought them for labor, for show, for worse things whispered about in dormitory darkness. But the alternative was watching Jamie get dragged away, watching her family torn apart like paper in wind. Jamie's hand found hers. "I'm scared." She looked at her brother. 8 years old, two thin eyes that used to sparkle before the factory accident killed their father, and grief killed their mother. She looked at Ellie still holding Billy, both of them watching her with desperate hope. She looked at Sarah, who never asked for anything because she'd learned early that asking led to disappointment. They needed her to decide. Right now. In this moment. Grace took Garrett's hand. His grip was firm but gentle, warm despite the cold. "Smart girl," he said quietly. "Let's get you all out of this snow." The wagon was covered, thank God. Canvas stretched over wooden hoops blocking the worst of the wind. Garrett lifted Billy first, then Ellie, then Jamie. Sarah climbed in herself before anyone could offer help. Grace hesitated at the wagon's edge. "Second thoughts?" Garrett asked. "About 100 of them." She studied his face, searching for any sign of what he really wanted. "You just spent $250 on 5 children you've never met. That's insane." "Probably. People don't do that." "Some do." "Why?" Garrett was quiet for a moment. Snow gathered on the brim of his hat on the shoulders of his coat. 25 years ago, he said finally, I had a brother, Robert. He was 12. Grace waited. There was a storm, worse than this one. We got separated from our folks lost in the snow. Garrett's jaw tightened. I was 15, old enough to know better, old enough to save him. What happened? I didn't. The words hung in the frozen air between them. By the time I found help, Robert was gone, frozen 10 feet from a line shack I didn't know was there. Garrett's voice was steady, but something in his eyes broke through the stone. I've spent 25 years wondering what would have happened if someone had helped us, if someone had seen 2 kids in trouble and done something. He offered his hand again to help her up. So does the reason matter if the result is the same? Grace thought about that, about all the reasons people had given for taking orphans. Free labor, tax benefits, showing off their Christian charity. None of those reasons had made the placements better or worse. What mattered was what happened after. I suppose not, she said. She took his hand and climbed into the wagon. The ranch was 20 miles north, 20 miles of frozen road howling wind and snow thick enough to erase the world. Grace sat at the front with Garrett watching him drive. Behind them, her siblings had burrowed into blankets like hibernating animals. Billy had finally stopped crying, exhausted into sleep. Ellie hummed softly some melody their mother used to sing. Jamie hadn't spoken since leaving the auction, and Sarah sat apart from everyone watching the white landscape with those unsettling gray eyes. The little one, Garrett said after a long silence. The dark-haired girl. What's her story? Sarah, Grace glanced back. She doesn't have one. Or she does, but she won't tell it. We found her at the orphanage about a year ago. Somebody left her on the doorstep like a package. She doesn't talk much, doesn't trust much. Neither do I, Garrett said. Fair enough. They rode in silence. The cold seeped in despite the canvas cover. Grace's fingers went numb, her toes burning with the particular pain of flesh slowly freezing. Here. Garrett shrugged off his leather coat and draped it around her shoulders. Can't have you freezing before we get there. What about you? I'm used to it. The coat was heavy warm. It smelled like leather and horses and something else. Tobacco maybe, or wood smoke. It smelled like safety, and Grace hated how much she wanted to bury herself in it. Can I ask you something, she said. You seem to ask a lot of questions. Is that a problem? No, means you're thinking. I'd rather have that than blind obedience. Grace filed that away. Useful information about this strange man who'd bought 5 orphans like they were worth something. At the auction, she said slowly, when Crawford was about to hit me, you stopped him. I did. You didn't have to. I know. Why? Garrett was quiet for a moment. The horses trudged through deepening snow, their breath steaming in the cold. When I was 15, he said finally, after Robert died, I spent a lot of years being angry. At God, at my parents, at myself, at everyone who didn't help when they could have. He clicked the reins, urging the horses faster. And somewhere along the way, I realized the anger wasn't hurting anyone but me. So I made a choice. Every time I see someone about to get hurt, someone I can help, I help. Doesn't matter who they are or what they've done, I help. Because nobody helped Robert. Grace absorbed this. It was, she decided, either the most honest thing an adult had ever told her or the most elaborate lie. Time would tell which. I'm not going to trust you, she said bluntly. Not yet. Maybe not ever. I've trusted people before, and it's never ended well. That's fine. It doesn't bother you? Why would it trust has to be earned? I haven't earned anything from you except suspicion. Garrett glanced at her sideways. Give me time, Grace May Dawson. I'll prove myself or I won't. Either way, you and your family have a roof over your heads and food in your bellies tonight. That's more than you had this morning. It was. She couldn't argue with that. Grace, the voice was soft, Jamie crawling up from the wagon bed to wedge himself between her and Garrett. What is it? Is this man going to keep us? Grace looked at Garrett. He looked back, waiting for her answer. I don't know yet, she said honestly. He has sad eyes. Jamie studied Garrett with the uncomfortable directness of children. Like Papa did after the factory hurt him, before he died. Garrett's expression flickered. Something crossed his face. Pain, maybe, or recognition. Your Papa worked in a factory, he asked Jamie. Jamie nodded. He printed newspapers. The machine got him. It was loud and there was blood and Mama screamed and screamed and... Jamie, Grace pulled her brother close. You don't have to talk about it. I want to. Jamie's voice was small but determined. Because if he knows about Papa, maybe he'll understand why I'm scared of loud noises. And why Grace gets angry when people grab us. And why Billy can't sleep without his blanket. Garrett was quiet for a long moment. Jamie, he said finally, I'm not going to pretend I understand everything you've been through. But I know what it's like to lose family. I know what it's like to carry that loss around, like a stone, in your chest. And I know that sometimes the only thing that helps is finding new people to carry it with you. Are you going to be one of those people? I'm going to try. Jamie considered this with 8-year-old solemnity. Then he nodded once and crawled back to rejoin the others. Grace watched him go. He's braver than me. He's not. Garrett kept his eyes on the road. He just has you to be brave for him. That's different. The first sign of the ranch appeared through the swirling snow, a massive wooden arch with Garrett burned into the timber. That's us, Garrett said. Welcome home. Home, the word stuck in Grace's throat. What emerged from the storm was bigger than anything she'd imagined. A 3-story house of timber and stone, windows glowing against the gray afternoon, smoke from 2 chimneys, barns and stables stretching into the white distance. You own all this, she breathed. 12,000 acres. That's impossible. One man can't own that much. One man can own whatever he can hold on to. Garrett guided the horses toward the house. My father started with 500 acres and a dream. I turned it into this. And now, he paused. Now I've got no one to leave it to. Before Grace could respond, the front door burst open. A woman in her late 50s strode onto the porch wrapped in a thick shawl, her face tight with worry. Henry Garrett, where have you been? The storm's getting worse by the minute, and Frank's been worried sick about the cattle and... She stopped dead. Are those children? They are. Garrett jumped down from the wagon. Mrs. Hayes, meet Grace, Jamie, Ellie, Billy, and Sarah. They're staying with us. Staying with... Henry, you can't just... There are procedures. Procedures are done. Garrett was already lifting Billy from the wagon bed. Right now, they need warmth, food, and beds. Everything else can wait till morning. Mrs. Hayes looked at the children. Really looked. At their thin faces and threadbare clothes. At Billy's clutched blanket and Ellie's tear-stained cheeks. At Jamie pressed against Grace's side and Sarah standing apart watching everything with those ancient gray eyes. Something in the older woman's expression shifted. Well, she said briskly, don't just stand there in the cold. Inside all of you, I'll put on soup. The interior of the house hit Grace like a physical force. Warmth, real warmth seeping into bones that had forgotten what it meant to be warm. She stood in the entrance hall dripping snowmelt onto floors that probably cost more than her father had made in a year, and tried to breathe. Don't touch nothing, she hisses at Billy, who was reaching for a porcelain vase. Everything can be touched. Garrett had appeared beside them, silent as a ghost. Everything can be broken. Things get replaced. Children don't. Grace didn't know how to respond to that. Mrs. Hayes swept through like a force of nature, gathering children and issuing orders. Hot baths, clean clothes, soup in the kitchen. Move, move, move. The next 2 hours blurred together. Water so warm it stung. Night clothes that smelled like lavender instead of mold. Soup thick with vegetables and meat served in a kitchen bigger than the entire dormitory Grace had shared with 11 other girls. Billy fell asleep at the table, his face nearly in his bowl. Ellie ate and ate and ate like she was afraid the food might disappear. Jamie pushed his soup around without tasting it. Sarah ate nothing, just watched. And Grace watched Garrett. He sat at the head of the table nursing coffee, saying little. But his eyes moved constantly, checking each child, noting who needed more food, who was struggling, who was scared. You're staring, he said without looking at her. You're confusing. How so? You bought 5 orphans, brought us to your fancy ranch, and now you're just sitting there drinking coffee like it's normal. It's not normal. Garrett finally met her eyes. Nothing about today has been normal, but I figure we've all had enough drama for one day. Sometimes the best thing you can do is just be quiet. Let people breathe. Grace considered this. I don't trust you, she said again. I know. I'm going to watch you every minute. If you do anything to hurt my family, I'll make you regret it. Garrett nodded slowly. Fair enough. You're not scared of a 10-year-old girl threatening you. I'm terrified because I think you mean it. And I think if I give you cause, you'd find a way to make good on that threat. I would. Then I'd better not give you cause. He stood draining his coffee. Mrs. Hayes will show you to your rooms. Get some sleep. Tomorrow we'll figure out the rest. He walked out without another word. Grace watched him go, this strange, sad man who'd upended her entire world with a handful of money and a single word. Family. She still didn't trust him, but for the first time in 2 years, she wanted to. The bedroom was bigger than any room Grace had ever slept in. 2 beds, real beds with thick mattresses and quilts that smelled like cedar. A window overlooking the snow-covered land. A dresser with an actual mirror. Ellie and Sarah were already in one bed, curled together despite the space. Billy had insisted on staying with Jamie in the next room. Grace had checked on them twice already. Both boys asleep, Billy's blanket clutched tight, Jamie's face finally peaceful. Now she stood at the window watching the storm rage outside. You can't sleep either. Sarah's voice soft and sudden. Grace turned. The younger girl was sitting up in bed, her dark hair loose around her pale face. How'd you know? You breathe different when you're awake. Sarah pulled her knees to her chest. You're scared. I'm not. Grace stopped. What was the point of lying? Yeah, I'm scared. Of what? Everything. That this is a trick, that he'll change his mind, that we'll wake up tomorrow and be back on that platform. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. He won't send us back, she said finally. How do you know? Because he looks at us the way Mama used to look at me. Sarah's voice was matter of fact, like she was stating obvious truth. Like we're important. Like we matter. Grace crossed to the bed, sat on the edge. You remember your mama. Sometimes, in pieces, she had dark hair and gray eyes, like mine. Sarah pulled the quilt tighter. Like his, a chill ran down Grace's spine that had nothing to do with the cold. Like, who's the man, Mr. Garrett? Sarah met Grace's gaze. He looks like someone I used to know. I can't remember who. Grace wanted to argue, wanted to explain that the world didn't work that way, that there was no such thing as fate or destiny, that they were just 5 unlucky kids who'd caught one lucky break. But looking at Sarah's gray eyes, so much like Garrett's, where was you? Now that she noticed she couldn't form the words. Go to sleep, she said instead. Whatever's supposed to happen will happen. But right now we need rest. Sarah nodded and lay back down, closing her eyes. Grace returned to the window. Downstairs, she heard voices. Garrett and Mrs. Hayes talking softly. You've lost your mind, Henry. Probably. 5 children. What are you going to do with 5 children? Raise them if they'll let me. Mrs. Hayes's voice gentled. This is about Robert, isn't it? You think you can make up for what happened by saving these strays? Maybe I do. Is that so wrong? A long pause. It's not wrong, it's just complicated. Those children are broken, Henry. They've been hurt in ways we can't imagine. I'm not trying to fix them. Garrett's voice dropped so low Grace had to strain to hear. I'm trying to give them space to fix themselves, and maybe in the process they'll help me fix whatever's broken in me too. Silence. Grace stepped back from the window. Her eyes burned, but she didn't cry. She'd learned long ago that tears were wasted effort, but something had shifted in her chest. Something she didn't quite understand. This man, this cold, quiet, broken man had looked at 5 unwanted children and seen something worth saving. Not labor, not charity cases, not burdens to be distributed or separated or forgotten. He'd seen people. It didn't mean she trusted him. Trust was earned. But for the first time in 2 years, Grace May Dawson allowed herself to imagine a future that didn't end in disappointment. It was terrifying. It was also, she realized as she finally climbed into bed, the first step towards something that might someday feel like home. The first crack appeared 3 days later. Grace had been waiting for it. Good things didn't last. She knew that better than anyone. So when the screaming started at 2 in the morning, she was almost relieved. Finally, the other shoe was dropping. She was out of bed before her mind fully woke, racing down the hall toward the boys' room. Billy's wails echoed through the house, raw and terrified, the kind of screaming that came from somewhere deeper than nightmares. Fire, fire, Mama, there's fire! Grace burst through the door. Billy was thrashing in his bed, tangled in blankets, eyes wide open but seeing nothing. Jamie crouched in the corner, hands over his ears, rocking back and forth. Billy, Grace grabbed his shoulders. Billy, wake up. There's no fire. You're safe. It's burning. Everything's burning. I can smell it. There's no fire. She pulled him against her chest, held him tight. Shh, shh, I've got you. You're at the ranch. Remember Mr. Garrett's ranch. We're safe. Footsteps thundered in the hallway. Garrett appeared in the doorway, hair disheveled, shirt half-buttoned. Behind him, Mrs. Hayes clutched a candle, her face pale. What happened? Garrett's voice was rough with sleep. Night terror. Grace didn't look up. He gets them sometimes. About the fire that killed his family. Billy was still sobbing, but the screaming had stopped. His small body shook against Grace's chest. I want Mama, he whimpered. I want to go home. I know, baby, I know. Garrett stepped into the room, moving slowly, carefully. He knelt beside Grace and Billy, keeping his distance, but close enough to help if needed. Hey, little man. His voice was gentler than Grace had ever heard it. Rough night, huh? Billy peeked out from Grace's arms. His face was wet with tears and snot, his eyes red and swollen. I saw the fire, he whispered. It was eating everything. I know. Fires are scary. Garrett reached out, hesitated, then gently touched Billy's shoulder. But you know what's good about fires? Billy shook his head. They go out. Every fire, no matter how big, eventually goes out. And then you rebuild. That's what people do. We rebuild. But Mama didn't rebuild. She went away. Grace felt her heart crack clean in half. Garrett was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was thick. You're right, some people can't rebuild. And that's the hardest thing in the world to understand. He moved closer slowly, giving Billy time to pull away if he wanted. But you know what your mama would want. What she'd want you to rebuild for her. She'd want you to grow up and be happy and live a good life. That's what mamas want for their babies. How do you know? Because that's what my mama wanted for me. And my brother Robert, the one who died in the snow, that's what she wanted for him too. Garrett's voice caught slightly. She told me after he was gone that the best way to honor him was to live well, to not let the fire or the snow or whatever took them. He paused. To not let it take my ability to be happy. Billy considered this with 5-year-old intensity. So if I'm happy, Mama wins. That's right, Mama wins. Something shifted in Billy's face. Not happiness. He was too young and too broken for that, but something like understanding. Okay, he said softly. I'll try. That's all anyone can ask. Garrett stood, joints cracking. Think you can go back to sleep? Billy looked at Grace, then at Jamie still huddled in the corner. Can we all sleep together in the big bed? Grace glanced at Garrett. He nodded once. I'll have Mrs. Hayes bring extra blankets, he said. You kids take my room. Bed's bigger. We can't take your room, Grace protested. You're not taking it. I'm giving it. He was already moving toward the door. I've got paperwork to catch up on anyway. Wasn't sleeping much. He left before she could argue further. They trooped down the hall to Garrett's room, all five of them, because Ellie and Sarah had appeared at some point, drawn by the commotion. The bed was massive, big enough to hold all of them with room to spare. Billy curled up in the middle, clutching his blanket. Jamie pressed against Grace's back. Ellie wrapped herself around Billy like a protective shell, and Sarah lay at the edge, watching the ceiling with those gray eyes. Ellie's voice was muffled by quilts. Yeah, is this what having a papa feels like? Grace didn't know how to answer that. Their real papa had been gentle but distant, always working, always tired. He'd loved them, she knew that. But he'd never knelt beside them in the middle of the night to talk about fires going out and Mama's winning. I don't know, she said honestly. Maybe. I think I like it. Don't get used to it. But even as she said the words, Grace felt their hollowness. Something had shifted tonight. Something she couldn't name and didn't want to examine too closely. She closed her eyes and for the first time in years fell asleep without fear. Epilogue. Returning to 1902. Grace's voice faded as the fire crackled lower in the hearth. Outside, the Wyoming night had deepened snow still falling in endless white. Will sat motionless in his chair, his eyes wide, his packed trunk forgotten in the hallway beyond. That was the night I started to believe, Grace said softly, her 60-year-old hands wrapped around the cold teacup. Not completely. Trust is a hard thing to build when it's been broken too many times. But I started to wonder. She met her grandson's eyes across the firelight. What if this man meant what he said? What if we really were safe? What if for the first time in my life someone had seen me and thought I was worth saving? Will swallowed hard. What happened next? Grace smiled, but it was a sad smile weighted with memory. Trust was just the beginning, Will. The hard part came next, because Reverend Crawford wasn't done with us, and the real battle was about to start. She stood, joints protesting after sitting so long, and placed a hand on her grandson's shoulder. But that's a story for tomorrow night. You need sleep. Boston's a long train ride. Grandmother, Will said, his voice stronger now. I'm not scared anymore. Good, because you're stronger than you think. Just like that 10-year-old girl on the auction platform. Grace squeezed his shoulder. Now go to bed. Tomorrow we'll talk about courtrooms and corrupt reverends and knife-wielding 6-year-olds. Will laughed despite himself and headed toward his room. Grace stood alone by the fire, listening to the house settle around her. Somewhere in the depths of the ranch, Henry was still awake, still unable to rest when memories stirred. 30 years, she thought. 30 years since that February day when everything changed. And tomorrow she would tell Will the rest. About Crawford's return, about the trial, about Sarah and the truth that had been hidden in gray eyes all along. But tonight she would let the boy sleep with hope instead of fear, just like Henry Garrett had done for 5 broken children on a winter night long ago. Will returned to the study the next evening without being asked. His trunk remained unpacked in the hallway, the train ticket to Boston still tucked in his coat pocket. But something had shifted in the boy's posture, the way he carried himself into the room where his grandmother waited by the fire. Grace looked up from the ledger she'd been reviewing ranch business that never quite stopped it even in winter. At 60, she still kept the books. For Garrett, ranch still knew every acre and every head of cattle, still made decisions that affected dozens of families across 3 counties. Couldn't sleep, she asked. Didn't want to. Will settled into the chair across from her. I kept thinking about that night, about Billy and the fire, and what you said about Mama winning. Grace closed the ledger, set it aside. Outside, the snow had stopped, leaving the world crystalline and still under a half moon. Inside, the fire painted everything in amber and shadow. That night changed things, she said. Not all at once, trust doesn't work that way, but it was a beginning. She leaned back, eyes distant with memory. The weeks that followed were like learning to breathe again. Slow, careful, always waiting for the moment when the air would run out. Will waited, knowing she would continue when ready. But before I tell you about Crawford's return, about the battle that nearly destroyed everything you need to understand what we were building, because you can't appreciate what you stand to lose until you know what you have. Grace's voice took on that particular quality again, the one that bridged decades. So let me tell you about the spring that followed that winter, about horses and libraries and a woman named Rachel Bennett, about the life we started to build before Crawford came back to tear it all down. Garrett Ranch, March 1872. Spring came to Wyoming like a promise barely kept. The snow retreated inch by stubborn inch, revealing brown earth and the first brave shoots of new grass. Grace marked the passage of time, not by calendar days, but by changes in her siblings. By the second week, Billy stopped hiding food under his mattress. Mrs. Hayes had caught him tucking away biscuits one morning, and instead of scolding, she simply started leaving extra on his nightstand. The boy still checked every night to make sure they were there, but he stopped hoarding them like a squirrel preparing for winter. Jamie began speaking in full sentences again. His nightmares faded from nightly terrors to occasional disturbances. Grace would still wake sometimes to find him standing at the window, staring out at the moonlit land, but he no longer flinched at every loud noise or sudden movement. Ellie devoured every book in Henry's library like a woman dying of thirst. She read by firelight and candlelight, and whenever the sun broke through clouds. She read at breakfast and dinner and late into the night. And when she'd exhausted the collection, she started writing stories of her own, filling notebooks with tales of brave children who found homes. Sarah bloomed in ways none of them expected. The silent girl who'd held a knife to Crawford's throat began spending hours in the barn with the horses. Frank Wilson, the ranch foreman, found her there one morning, talking to Silverwind, the gray mare that hadn't let anyone touch her in 15 years. "That horse don't trust nobody," Frank told Grace later, his weathered face creased with wonder. "Been here since she was a foal. Something spooked her bad when she was young. But your sister, she just walks up, and that mare settles like she's known her all her life." Grace watched from the barn door as Sarah stood beside Silverwind, one small hand on the mare's neck, both of them breathing in rhythm. The girl's dark hair caught the light, filtering through gaps in the boards. Her gray eyes, so much like Henry's, reflected something Grace had never seen there before. Peace. But it was the work that changed Grace most of all. Henry took her riding fence lines with Frank, teaching her to read the land the way other men read books. He showed her how weather moved across the sky, how to spot a sick cow from 100 yards, how to calculate profit margins and feed costs, and every detail that went into running 12,000 acres. "You're a quick study," Frank said one afternoon as they checked water troughs in the north pasture. "Boss says you've got a sharper mind than most men I know." "Why are you teaching me this?" Grace asked, genuinely confused. "I'm just what a child." Frank spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "Miss Grace, you stopped being just a child the day you stood on that platform and fought grown men to keep your family together. Now you're learning to run a ranch because someday this'll all be yours. Mine, yours. All 5 of you kids." Frank's eyes were serious. "Boss told me himself he's building something here, a legacy, and he means for you to inherit it." The words hit Grace like a physical blow. She'd never thought past next week, next month. The idea of a future that stretched years, decades into the distance was too big to comprehend, but it planted itself in her mind like a seed in spring soil. On a Tuesday morning in late March, Sarah disappeared. Grace noticed her absence around midday, that sick lurch in the stomach that comes from knowing something's wrong before you can name what. One moment the 6-year-old had been in the kitchen with Mrs. Hayes, the next she was gone. Grace's first instinct was panic, the kind that makes your vision narrow and your breath come short. She grabbed Jamie's arm hard enough to leave marks. "When did you last see her?" "I don't know, breakfast maybe." Grace was already running for the door when Mrs. Hayes' voice stopped her cold. "She's in the barn." Grace spun. "What?" "I saw her slip out about an hour ago. She's been sitting with the horses." Mrs. Hayes continued kneading dough, her hands steady, her expression calm. "She's fine, child. She can't just wander off. She could get lost, hurt, or..." Grace, Mrs. Hayes wiped flour from her hands, placed them on Grace's shoulders. That child hasn't relaxed once since she got here. She watches everyone, catalogs every exit, sleeps with one eye open. The older woman's eyes were knowing. Sound familiar? Grace flushed. If sitting with horses makes her feel safe, let her sit with horses. She'll come back when she's ready. Every instinct Grace had screamed to run to the barn to drag Sarah back where she could see her, protect her, keep her safe. But Mrs. Hayes was right. Sarah needed space. They all did. Fine, Grace said through gritted teeth. But if she's not back by dinner, then you can go get her. Deal. Sarah returned on her own about an hour before sunset. She slipped through the kitchen door like a shadow, her dark hair tangled with hay, her gray eyes brighter than Grace had ever seen them. Where were you? The barn. There's a horse, a gray one. She let me touch her. You can't just disappear like that. I was worried. I know. Sarah didn't apologize, but there was acknowledgement in her voice. I needed to think. Think about what. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that made Grace's blood run cold. About how this feels wrong. Wrong, how? Not bad wrong, just. Sarah struggled for words. Too right, too easy. Things don't just get better. Not for kids like us. Grace sat down heavily, pulling Sarah onto the chair beside her. I know what you mean. You do? Yeah, I keep waiting for something to go wrong, for him to change his mind, for all of this to disappear. Sarah's small face was solemn beyond her years. What if it doesn't? Then I guess we learn to live with good things happening, Grace said slowly, even if it feels impossible. That sounds hard. Harder than the bad stuff sometimes. They sat in silence until Mrs. Hayes called them for dinner, two children learning to carry hope like a fragile thing that might shatter if held too tight. The next day brought Rachel Bennett. Grace was in the kitchen helping Mrs. Hayes with bread when the sound of hoofbeats announced a visitor. Through the window, she watched a woman dismount from a chestnut mare with the easy confidence of someone who'd spent a lifetime in the saddle. Rachel Bennett was in her early 30s, auburn-haired and green-eyed, dressed in practical wool that had seen work and weather. A rifle rested in a scabbard on her saddle, and she carried herself like someone who knew how to use it. That's Mrs. Bennett from the next property over, Mrs. Hayes said, wiping flour from her hands. Widow. Runs 2,000 acres on her own since her husband passed 3 years back. Good woman, sharp as a tack. Rachel knocked once, then let herself in with the familiarity of an old friend. Dorothy, she called. I brought that jar of preserves I promised, and. Her eyes landed on Grace. Well now, you must be one of the children everyone in town's gossiping about. Grace straightened, defensive. We're not gossip, we're people. Rachel's smile was genuine. I like you already. You've got spine. She set the preserves on the table and studied Grace with frank assessment. Let me guess, you're the protector, the oldest, the one who'd fight a bear barehanded if it threatened your family. Grace said nothing, but her silence was answer enough. Good. This world needs more fighters. Rachel glanced around. Where's Henry? In the barn with Frank and the boys. I'll find him then. But first. Rachel's eyes fixed on Grace again. You're learning the ranch business, I hear. Some. Don't sell yourself short. Frank says you're sharp as a whip and twice as quick. That's high praise from a man who doesn't give compliments easy. She leaned against the table. You ever need someone to talk to someone who's not Henry or Dorothy or one of your siblings, you come find me. Understand, running a place like this, being responsible for people, it's lonely. Good to have someone who understands. Grace nodded slowly, filing away this information. An ally, potentially. Rachel found Henry in the barn. Grace, curious despite herself, followed at a distance that allowed her to hear without being seen. She'd learned the skill at the orphanage, where survival often depended on knowing what adults were planning before they acted on it. They're settling in well, Rachel was saying. I saw the oldest girl, Grace. She's got steel in her. She does. Henry's voice carried warmth Grace wasn't used to hearing. Reminds me of you, actually. Same stubborn refusal to break. Careful, Henry Garrett. That almost sounded like a compliment. There was something in Rachel's tone, something Grace couldn't quite name. Not flirtation exactly, but something gentler. Something like affection, worn smooth by years of friendship. The little one, Rachel continued, the dark-haired girl with the gray eyes, Sarah. Henry went very quiet. She's Robert's, isn't she? The silence stretched so long, Grace thought Henry might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. I don't know, I can't know, and I won't get that child's hopes up based on gray eyes and a feeling. Henry, she's already family. His voice was firm now. All five of them are. It doesn't matter whose blood runs where, I chose them. That's what matters. Rachel was quiet for a moment, then softer. You're a good man, Henry Garrett. Better than you give yourself credit for. I'm trying to be. That's more than most people can say. Grace slipped her away before they could notice her, but the conversation stayed with her, turning over in her mind like a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. Gray eyes, Robert's, Sarah's. The pieces were there waiting to be assembled. Grace just wasn't ready to see the picture yet. 5 weeks after the auction on a Sunday morning, bright with false spring sunshine, Silas Crawford came back. Grace saw the wagon approaching from the kitchen window. She'd been helping Mrs. Hayes knead bread, her hands deep in dough, when something made her look up. Some animal instinct that recognizes predators before the mind catches up. Someone's coming. Mrs. Hayes looked up, squinted through the frost, still clinging to the glass despite the warming day. Her face went pale. Get the children upstairs. Why, who is it? Just do it, now. Grace didn't argue. She'd learned to recognize that tone, the one that meant danger was close and questions could wait. She wiped her hands on her apron and ran. Jamie and Billy were in the parlor playing with wooden blocks Henry had carved for them. Ellie sat by the fire, nose deep in a book about frontier exploration. Upstairs, Grace ordered. All of you, now. Why? Ellie looked up, marking her page. What's wrong? I don't know yet. Just go. Jamie grabbed Billy's hand without question. They'd done this before, fled from trouble, hidden from danger. The instinct was burned into their bones. But Ellie hesitated, and that moment of hesitation cost them. The front door burst open. Reverend Silas Crawford stood in the entrance hall, snow swirling around him, even though the day was clear. No, not snow, just the sense of cold that came with him, the chill of a man who saw children as merchandise and called it God's work. Behind him stood two men Grace didn't recognize. Big men hard-faced with the look of hired muscle who'd break bones for coin and sleep soundly after. Where is Henry Garrett? Crawford's voice was silk over steel. He's not here. Grace planted herself in the hallway, blocking the path to the stairs. He's working the cattle. Won't be back till evening. Perfect. Crawford's smile made her skin crawl. Then we'll take the children and be gone before he returns. Grace's blood turned to ice. You can't do that. I can, and I will. Crawford reached into his coat, pulled out a folded document. This is a court order from Judge Harrison in Helena. It declares Henry Garrett's guardianship null and void and remands all 5 children to my custody pending a formal hearing. You're lying. I assure you I am not. Crawford's eyes were cold as winter stone. Mr. Garrett may have bought you with money, but he cannot buy legitimacy. A single man living alone with no wife, no experience raising children. The territorial court takes a dim view of such arrangements. He tucked the document back into his coat. Now gather your siblings and come quietly. I'd hate for this to become unpleasant. I'm not going anywhere with you. The first man moved fast and brutal. He grabbed Grace's arm, wrenched it behind her back. Pain shot through her shoulder like lightning, white hot and blinding. Grace didn't cry out, wouldn't give them the satisfaction. Let her go. The voice cut through the entrance hall like a blade, sharp and cold and absolutely steady. Sarah stood at the top of the stairs. Jamie and Billy were behind her. Ellie clutched the railing with white-knuckled hands, and Sarah held a kitchen knife. Well, well, Crawford's smile widened. The silent one speaks, and with such dramatic flair. Let my sister go, or I'll cut you. You're 6-year-old child. Put down the knife before you hurt yourself. Sarah descended the stairs slowly, deliberately. The knife was steady in her small hand. Her gray eyes, those eyes so much like Henry's, never left Crawford's face. I've hurt people before, she said quietly. When they tried to take me places I didn't want to go. She paused on the 3rd step from the bottom. The man at the orphanage, the one who liked to visit the girls' dormitory at night. Another pause. He doesn't have all his fingers anymore. Grace felt the grip on her arm loosen slightly. The man holding her was looking at Sarah with something approaching unease. "You're bluffing," Crawford said, but his voice had lost some of its confidence. "Try me." The standoff stretched tension thick enough to choke on. Grace's mind raced, searching for escape routes, for weapons, for anything that might shift the balance. The front door opened again. What in the hell is going on here? Rachel Bennett stood in the doorway, tall and furious, her rifle slung over her shoulder, with the casual ease of someone who knew exactly how to use it. "Mrs. Bennett," Crawford's tone cooled, "this doesn't concern you. A man breaking into my neighbor's home with hired thugs, I think it concerns me plenty." Rachel stepped inside, her hand resting on her rifle. "Let the girl go. Now. I have a court order. I don't care if you have a letter from God himself. You don't drag children out of their home in the middle of the day." Rachel's eyes were ice. "Let her go." The man released Grace's arm. She stumbled forward, immediately positioning herself between Crawford and the stairs. "This isn't over," Crawford said, his voice tight with barely contained rage. "The law is on my side. Those children belong in proper Christian custody, not with a godless bachelor who thinks he can buy whatever he wants." "Then take it up with the courts," Rachel said, "properly, through legal channels, not with strong arm tactics and ambush." She raised her rifle slightly. "Now get out of this house before I decide you're trespassing, and act accordingly." Crawford held her gaze for a long, poisonous moment. Then he turned on his heel and strode out, and his men following. The door slammed behind them. Rachel lowered her rifle, let out a long breath. "Is everyone all right?" Grace's legs gave out. She sat down hard on the floor, shaking so badly her teeth chattered. "Grace." Sarah was beside her in an instant. The knife discarded her small hands, gripping Grace's shoulders. "Grace, breathe. They're gone. Breathe." "I'm okay." Grace wasn't okay. She was terrified and furious and sick with the knowledge of how close they'd come. "I'm okay." Rachel knelt beside them, her expression softening. "You must be Grace. Henry's told me about you. Says you're the bravest person he's ever met." She helped Grace to her feet. "I'm starting to see why." After Rachel left to find Henry, after the other children had been calmed and settled, Grace sat in the parlor, staring at nothing. Her arm throbbed where the man had grabbed her. The bruise was already forming dark purple, spreading across pale skin. Mrs. Hayes brought tea Grace didn't drink. Ellie sat close, not touching, but present. Jamie wouldn't let go of her hand, and Sarah stood at the window watching the road, the knife tucked back into her apron pocket. When Henry came home, he came like a storm made flesh. Grace heard the horse before she saw it. Hoofbeats pounding, frozen ground coming fast, too fast for her safety. Then the front door crashed open and Henry was there, wild-eyed, breathing hard. "Where are they?" His voice was barely human. "I'll kill them. I'll kill them all." "Henry." Rachel stepped forward, hands raised. "Henry, look at me. The children are safe. Everyone's okay." He put his hands on her. Henry found Grace, saw the bruise already darkening on her arm. "He put his hands on my daughter." The words hit Grace like a physical blow. My daughter. He'd said it before, but this was different. This was rage and love and absolute certainty all wrapped together. "I'm fine," Grace managed. Sarah scared them off with a knife. Henry looked at Sarah. Something flickered across his face. Pride, maybe, or fear, or both. "Show me the court order." "He took it with him," Grace said, "but he said it was from Judge Harrison and Helena." "Harrison?" Henry's jaw clenched. "That snake. Crawford must have bribed him." Rachel crossed her arms. "Can he do that? Can a judge just take them away?" "He can try," Henry's voice was steel. "But I didn't spend $250 and 5 weeks building a family just to let a corrupt preacher tear it apart." He knelt down, bringing himself to eye level with all 5 children. "Listen to me, all of you." He waited until 5 pairs of eyes were fixed on him. "Nobody is taking you anywhere. I don't care what papers they wave or what judges they've bought. You're my family. I will fight for you with everything I have." "But what if you lose?" Billy's voice was barely a whisper. Henry's expression softened. "Then I'll keep fighting. And when I'm done fighting, I'll find another way. I'm not giving up on you. Not ever. Do you understand? Billy nodded, tears streaming down his face. Good. The war council formed around the kitchen table. Henry, Rachel, Mrs. Hayes, Frank Wilson called in from the barns, and Grace because she'd earned the right to be there. I need to get to Helena, Henry said. Talk to a real judge. Get this thrown out. In this weather, Rachel shook her head. The passes are barely open. It's a hard 3-day ride in good conditions. I don't care. Henry, Rachel's hand came down on his arm firm. Think, if you leave now, you leave these children unprotected. Crawford could come back with more men, more legal paper for... Then what do you suggest? Send Frank to Helena. He knows the territory better than anyone. You stay here, protect your family, and we gather support from the town. Henry laughed, but there was no humor in it. The town. The town that's been calling me crazy for taking in 5 orphans. The town that crosses the street to avoid us. Not everyone, Rachel said. There are good people here, Henry. People who remember what it's like to need help and not get it. Let me talk to them. The silence stretched. Grace watched Henry war with himself, watched fear and fury and helplessness chase across his face. Fine, he said finally. Frank goes to Helena tomorrow. You work on the town. He looked at Grace. And we prepare for war. That night, Grace couldn't sleep. She found Henry on the porch staring out at the snow-covered land, his breath making clouds in the cold air. Can't sleep either, she asked, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. Too much to think about. She stood beside him, following his gaze to where stars scattered across the black sky like diamonds thrown by a careless hand. Thank you, she said finally, for what you said about fighting for us. I meant it, every word. I know, that's why it matters. They stood in comfortable silence for a while. Then Grace said, when you called me your daughter, did you mean that too? Henry turned, met her eyes. Grace, from the moment you slapped that farmer's hand away at the auction, you've been my daughter. I just didn't know if you'd let me say it out loud. Grace's eyes burned, but she didn't cry. You can say it. I won't run away. Henry pulled her into a hug. She let herself be held, let herself be small for just a moment. We're going to win this, she said into his chest. Because you mean it. Because you chose us when you didn't have to. Because for the first time in my life, I believe someone when they say they won't give up. Grace Mitchell Garrett, Henry said quietly, you are the strongest person I've ever known. I had to be. But maybe, she pulled back, searched for words, maybe now I can learn how to be something else too, something softer. Because I finally have someone to catch me if I fall. They stood together under the stars, 2 people learning to be family, and for the first time, Grace understood what home really meant. Not a place, not walls and roof and warm beds. Home was someone who'd fight for you even when the odds were impossible. Home was someone who saw you broken and loved you anyway. Home was this. Epilogue. Winter 1902, third night. Grace's voice faded into silence. The fire had burned low embers glowing like memories in the dark. Will sat forward in his chair, his hands gripped together. Crawford came back, he said. Just like that. Just walked in and tried to take you. Just like that, Grace confirmed. And that was only the beginning. The real fight, the one that would determine everything, was still to come. She stood stretched, muscles gone stiff from sitting. But that's enough for tonight. Tomorrow I'll tell you about the trial. About what happened when we stood in front of Judge Crane and fought for our family. About Sarah and the truth that finally came to light. Grandmother, Will said as she moved toward the door, when you stood up to Crawford when Sarah pulled that knife, weren't you terrified? Grace paused, one hand on the doorframe. Every second, she said. But fear and courage aren't opposites, Will. Courage is being afraid and doing it anyway. That's what Sarah taught me that day. That's what all of us learned. She looked back at her grandson, this boy about to leave for Boston, about to face his own battles. You're going to be afraid sometimes. That's good. It means you're paying attention. But don't let the fear stop you. Do what's right. Fight for what matters. And remember that strength isn't about never falling down. She smiled. It's about getting back up every single time. Will nodded, understanding settling over his face like first light. Grace left him there by the dying fire, thinking about courage and fear and the fights that shape us. Tomorrow she'd tell him the rest, about courtrooms and testimonies and the moment when everything hung in the balance. But tonight she'd let him sit with what he'd learned. That family was worth fighting for. That trust once broken could be rebuilt. And that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is accept help when it's offered, even when every instinct says to run. Outside, the Wyoming night settled deep and cold over Garrett Ranch. Inside, the fires burned and the house creaked, and somewhere in the darkness, Henry Garrett walked the halls, checking locks and windows, still protecting the family he'd chosen 30 years ago. Some habits Grace knew you never outgrow. Some loves never fade. And some fights are worth having again and again, because what you're fighting for is everything that matters. The study felt different on the fourth night. Will had stopped pretending he might still leave for Boston on schedule. His trunk sat unpacked, his train ticket lay forgotten on the dresser upstairs. Some stories demand to be heard in their entirety, and this was one of them. Grace settled into her chair with a heaviness that spoke of the weight of what came next. At 60 years old, she carried the memories of that spring like scars that had healed but never quite faded. The trial, she said without preamble, that's what you're waiting to hear about. Will nodded, leaning forward. 2 weeks, Grace continued. That's how long we had to prepare. 2 weeks to gather testimonials, to coach 5 terrified children on what to say in court, to build a case strong enough to stand against a man who'd bought himself a judge. She stared into the fire, seeing not the flames but a courtroom from 30 years past. I've stood in a lot of courtrooms since then, Will. Argued dozens of cases, won most of them. But nothing has ever felt like that day. Because it wasn't about money or property or pride. It was about whether 5 children had the right to stay with the only person who had ever fought for them. Her hands tightened on the arms of her chair. Let me tell you about the day we went to war. Garrett Ranch, April 1872. The 2 weeks before the trial passed in a blur of frantic preparation. Frank Wilson rode to Helena and returned with news that Judge Samuel Crane, a circuit judge known for fairness, had agreed to hear the case. Crawford's order from Judge Harrison had been suspended pending review. They had a chance, a slim one, but a chance nonetheless. Rachel Bennett became a force of nature. She went door to door in town speaking to anyone who would listen about what Crawford had done. The response surprised everyone. It started with small things. A pie left on the porch with no note. A bundle of warm clothes appearing by the gate. Then people started coming in person. Miss Patterson, the school teacher, arrived with a basket of books. I heard what happened. I wanted you to know that not everyone in town agrees with Reverend Crawford. Could have fooled me, Grace muttered. No, she's right. Miss Patterson's face reddened. We haven't been welcoming. We've gossiped and judged based on nothing but our own small-mindedness. I'm sorry. She set down the basket. These are for the children, to help with their studies. Others followed. Farmers who'd been at the auction, shamefaced and apologetic. Shopkeepers offering credit. The doctor promising free care if any of them got sick. The tide was shifting, but Grace knew it might not be enough. Henry spent the 2 weeks collecting testimonials. Letters poured in from across the territory, stories of his quiet generosity. A farmer whose barn he'd rebuilt after a fire, no charge. A widow whose medical bills he'd paid anonymously. Workers given extra wages during hard winters. I didn't know you did any of this, Grace said, reading through the letters one evening. Wasn't for show. Henry gathered the papers, organizing them for the lawyer he'd finally agreed to hire. Just seemed like the right thing to do. These could help? Maybe, but it's not really about me. It's about you kids, whether you're better off here or somewhere else. We're better off here, Grace said fiercely. The judge might not see it that way. A bachelor with no experience, no wife, no proper family structure. Family isn't about structure. Family is about who shows up, who stays, who fights for you even when it's hard. Henry looked at her for a long moment. When did you get so wise? When life stopped giving me any other choice. Rachel coached the children on what to expect in court. Jamie nervous and stammering. Ellie pragmatic and prepared. Billy confused about why they had to prove they belonged. And Sarah silent as always, watching everything with those gray eyes. What will they ask? Ellie wanted to know. About your life before, about your life now, about whether Henry is a good guardian. He is, Ellie's voice was firm. He lets me read. He doesn't make me small. Perfect. Say exactly that. Grace worked with Billy separately. At 5 years old, he was too young to understand the complexities, too fragile to be put through questioning. But if they called him to testify, he needed to be ready. "What if I say the wrong thing?" Billy asked, clutching his ever-present blanket. "There's no wrong thing, baby. Just tell the truth. Tell them how you feel here." "Safe." The answer was immediate, instinctive. "I feel safe." "Then that's what you say." The night before the trial, Grace found Henry in the study surrounded by papers, testimonials, character references, legal documents, evidence of a life lived quietly trying to do right. "You should be resting," he said without looking up. "So should you." She sat across from him, studying his face in the lamplight. The lines had deepened over the past 2 months. Worry etched itself into flesh. "Are you scared?" she asked. "Terrified." "You don't look terrified." "I've had practice hiding it. 25 years of practice." He set down his pen, met her eyes. "Grace, if this goes wrong, it won't. But if it does," insistent now, "I need you to know something." He reached across the desk, took her hand. "These past 2 months have been the best of my life. Not despite the fear and the challenges and the uncertainty. Because of them. Because of you, Five. Because you gave me a reason to wake up every morning that wasn't just about surviving another day." His voice thickened. "Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to remember. You saved me, not the other way around." Grace squeezed his hand. "We're going to win tomorrow. Because you mean it. Because you chose us when you didn't have to. Because for the first time in my life, I believe someone when they say they won't give up." Henry's eyes glistened in the lamplight. "Grace Mitchell Garrett, you are the strongest person I've ever known." "I had to be. But maybe," she searched for words, "maybe now I can learn how to be something else too. Something softer. Because I finally have someone to catch me if I fall." They sat together in the quiet study, two people on the eve of battle holding on to each other against the uncertainty of tomorrow. The courtroom smelled like old wood and cold fear. Grace sat on a bench behind Henry, her siblings pressed close on either side. Jamie wouldn't let go of her hand. Billy clutched his blanket so tight his knuckles were white. Ellie kept her eyes fixed on the floor, breathing carefully. And Sarah watched everything, cataloging exits, counting enemies, preparing for the worst. Judge Samuel Crane took his seat at the front of the room. He was older than Grace expected, silver-haired with deep lines carved by decades of hard decisions. His eyes moved slowly across the courtroom, taking in every face, every tension, every unspoken word. "This court is now in session." His voice was quiet, but it carried like thunder. "The matter before us is the custody of 5 minor children currently residing with Mr. Henry Garrett. Reverend Silas Crawford has petitioned to have these children removed and placed in church custody pending adoption. Mr. Garrett contests this petition." Crawford sat at one table, flanked by a lawyer in an expensive suit. He looked calm, confident, righteous. The kind of man who believed God was on his side and acted accordingly. Henry sat at the other table, alone. He'd refused to hire a lawyer in the end, said he couldn't afford to put his trust in someone else's words. Rachel Bennett sat in the gallery, along with Miss Patterson, Mrs. Hayes, Frank Wilson, and a dozen other townspeople who'd come to show support. It wasn't enough. Grace knew it wasn't enough. "Reverend Crawford," Judge Crane said, "you may present your case." Crawford stood, smoothing his black coat with deliberate care. "Your Honor, this is a simple matter of propriety and child welfare. Mr. Garrett, while wealthy, is a bachelor with no experience raising children. He lives alone on a remote ranch with no wife, no female presence, to guide young girls through the complexities of womanhood." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Furthermore, Mr. Garrett acquired these children through unorthodox means. He paid $250 at a public placement fair, essentially purchasing them like livestock. This is not adoption, Your Honor. This is commerce, and commerce has no place in the sacred responsibility of raising children." Grace's hands clenched into fists. Billy whimpered beside her. "The church offers these children structure, education, moral guidance. We have facilities designed specifically for orphaned youth. We have trained staff who understand their needs." Crawford's voice oozed sincerity. "Mr. Garrett, whatever his intentions, simply cannot provide what these children require. They need proper oversight. They need the stability of an established institution. They need to be placed with families who can give them the traditional upbringing that society expects. He sat down, satisfaction written across his face. Judge Crane turned to Henry. Mr. Garrett, your response. Henry stood. His hands were steady, but Grace could see the tension in his shoulders, the set of his jaw. Your Honor, I'm not going to pretend I know what I'm doing. When I stepped onto that platform 2 months ago, I didn't have a plan. I saw 5 children being torn apart by strangers who wanted to use them, and I couldn't walk away. He paused, gathering himself. The Reverend is right that I'm a bachelor, right that I live alone, right that I paid money to take these children home. But he's wrong about what that means. Explain, Judge Crane said. I didn't buy these children, in Your Honor. I bought their freedom. Freedom from being separated, sold off to different families who saw them as cheap labor instead of human beings. Freedom from a system that treats orphans like merchandise. Henry's voice hardened. I've seen what happens to children placed through the Reverend's program, worked to death on farms, beaten for small mistakes. Worse things I won't speak aloud in mixed company. Crawford shot to his feet. Objection. These are baseless accusations. Sit down, Reverend. Judge Crane's voice was ice. You'll have your chance to respond. Mr. Garrett, continue. I don't have a wife, Henry admitted, but I have Mrs. Dorothy Hayes, who's helped run my household for 15 years and raised 3 children of her own. I have Rachel Bennett, my neighbor, who's been visiting daily to help with the children's education. I have an entire community, he gestured at the gallery, who've come forward to support these children despite the Reverend's attempts to turn them against us. Henry turned to look at Grace and her siblings, and I have 5 of the bravest, strongest, most resilient I've ever met. They don't need me to save them. They've already saved themselves 100 times over. All I'm doing is giving them a safe place to keep doing it. He sat down. The courtroom was silent. Then Judge Crane said the words that changed everything. I'd like to hear from the children. Grace's heart stopped. Crawford stood immediately. Your Honor, surely you can't expect to take the word of children over. I can and I will. The judge's gaze was sharp. These are the people whose lives we're deciding. They have a right to speak. He looked at Grace. You're the oldest. Grace Mitchell, is that correct? Grace stood on shaking legs. Yes, sir. Come forward. She walked to the front of the courtroom, feeling every eye on her. Henry gave her a small nod as she passed. Trust, encouragement, faith. She sat in the witness chair, her hands clasped tight in her lap. Miss Mitchell, Judge Crane said, tell me about your life for Mr. Garrett. Grace swallowed hard. I had parents once. My father worked in a printing factory in Boston. My mother was a seamstress. They were good people, kind people. What happened to them? My father got caught in a machine. It crushed his arm. Infection killed him 2 weeks later. Her voice stayed flat, controlled. My mother couldn't work enough to support us alone. She got sick. Fever took her 6 months after Papa died. And then St. Catherine's Orphanage. 2 years of sharing a bed with 3 other girls, eating food that was more water than substance. Being told every day that we were burdens, charity cases, lucky to be alive. Judge Crane's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Then the train brought us west. They told us we'd find families good homes. Instead, we found auctions where farmers poked at us like cattle. She paused, breathed, and Reverend Crawford told us to be grateful anyone wanted us at all. And Mr. Garrett, Grace looked at Henry, really looked at him. Mr. Garrett didn't poke or prod. He didn't ask how much work we could do or whether we'd cause trouble. He asked if we wanted to come with him. Her voice cracked slightly. He gave us a choice. Nobody had ever given us a choice before. Has he been good to you? He's been better than good. He sat with my little brother during nightmares. He let my sister Sarah have space when she needed it instead of forcing her to perform gratitude. He's learning how to braid Ellie's hair because he noticed she missed having someone do it. Grace struggled for words. He's trying. Every day he's trying. That's more than anyone else has ever done for us. Thank you, Miss Mitchell. Judge Crane turned to Crawford. Your witness. Crawford stood, his smile predatory. Miss Mitchell, you seem very articulate for a 10-year-old. Almost rehearsed, one might say. Nobody rehearsed me. Of course not. Tell me, did Mr. Garrett ever explain why he really took you in, a wealthy bachelor with no family, suddenly acquiring 5 children? Seems unusual, don't you think? He told us about his brother Robert, the one who died in the snow. Something flickered across Crawford's face. He hadn't expected that. So you're aware that Mr. Garrett has a history of loss, of failure. He couldn't save his own brother, and now he's trying to ease his guilt by playing savior to you unfortunate waifs. Grace's temper flared. That's not, isn't that exactly what's happening? A damaged man using damaged children to make himself feel better? No, her voice was steel. What's happening is a good man trying to do the right thing, something you wouldn't understand. I understand more than you know, child. Crawford leaned closer. I understand that you're protecting him because you're afraid, afraid that if you tell the truth about what really happens in that house, you'll be thrown back into the system. Nothing happens in that house. Grace was on her feet now, shaking with rage. Nothing except kindness and patience and people actually caring whether we live or die. You want to talk about what happens in houses? Let's talk about the placements you made, Reverend. Let's talk about the Miller farm, where Johnny Thompson lost 3 fingers to frostbite because they made him sleep in the barn. Let's talk about the Hicks family who beat Mary Sullivan so badly she couldn't walk for a week. Let's talk about Miss Mitchell. Judge Crane's voice cut through her fury. Please sit down. Reverend Crawford, control your questioning, or I'll find you in contempt. Grace sank back into the chair, her whole body trembling. She'd gone too far, ruined everything. But when she looked at Judge Crane, she didn't see anger. She saw something else entirely. I'd like to hear from the other children, he said quietly, one at a time. Jamie went next. He spoke in a voice barely above a whisper, telling the judge about his fear of loud noises since watching their father die, about how Henry noticed and started warning him before making sudden sounds, about feeling safe for the first time since Boston. Do you want to stay with Mr. Garrett? Judge Crane asked. Yes, sir. Please, sir. Jamie's voice broke. He's the only papa I've had since mine died. Ellie talked about books and libraries, about how Henry let her read anything she wanted instead of telling her girls shouldn't fill their heads with stories, about Mrs. Hayes teaching her to cook, about Rachel lending her novels about brave women who had adventures. He doesn't make me small, Ellie said. Most people want girls to be small and quiet and grateful. Mr. Garrett lets me be big. Billy couldn't stop crying long enough to speak coherently, but his desperate grip on his ragged blanket and the way he kept looking at Henry said more than words could. When the judge gently asked, "Do you feel safe with Mr. Garrett?" Billy managed through tears. He says Mama wins if I'm happy, so I'm trying to be happy. I'm trying real hard. There wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. Then it was Sarah's turn. She walked to the witness chair like she was walking to an execution. Small, pale, dark hair braided neatly, gray eyes fixed on some distant point. Miss Sarah, Judge Crane said gently. Do you have a last name? No, sir, I was left at the orphanage without papers. They just called me Sarah. Do you remember anything about your life before the orphanage? Long pause. I remember a woman with gray eyes like mine. I think she was my mother. And I remember a man talking about mountains, about a ranch where horses ran free. Grace saw Henry stiffen. But mostly, Sarah continued, I remember being alone and scared, and learning that if you want to survive, you can't trust anyone. Has that changed? Sarah looked at Henry. Something passed between them. Recognition, connection. I'm learning. Mr. Garrett doesn't make promises he can't keep. He doesn't pretend everything is fine when it isn't. He tells the truth even when it's hard. Pause. I trust him. I don't trust many people, but I trust him. Crawford stood for cross-examination, but his confidence had visibly cracked. Sarah, you said you don't remember your family. Is it possible that Mr. Garrett has manipulated your memories? Convinced you? Nobody manipulates me. Sarah's voice was ice. I see things clearly, more clearly than most adults. She turned those gray eyes on Crawford. I see you, Reverend. I see what you really are. Ah, and what is that? A man who uses God's name to hurt children. Sarah didn't flinch. I've known men like you. They smile and speak softly and pretend to care. But underneath, they only care about power, about control, about making themselves feel big by making others feel small. The courtroom went absolutely silent. I see you, Sarah repeated, and I'm not afraid of you anymore. Judge Crane called a recess. Grace found her siblings in the hallway huddled together like they'd done at the auction. Henry stood apart talking quietly with Rachel. His face was pale drawn. Did I ruin it? Grace asked, approaching him. When I lost my temper. You were magnificent. Henry pulled her into a hug, surprising them both. All of you were. Whatever happens next, I'm proud of you. What do you think will happen? Henry didn't answer. He didn't have to. The uncertainty in his eyes said everything. They filed back into the courtroom an hour later. Judge Crane took his seat, his expression unreadable. I've heard testimony from both sides, he said. I've reviewed the documentation provided by Reverend Crawford and the character witnesses provided by Mr. Garrett. I've listened to 5 children speak about their experiences with remarkable honesty and courage. He paused, letting the silence stretch. Custody matters are never simple. We must balance the welfare of the children against societal norms, religious considerations, and practical concerns. Reverend Crawford raises valid points about Mr. Garrett's unconventional situation. Grace's heart sank. However, Judge Crane leaned forward. I am also compelled to consider the testimony of the children themselves. These are not infants incapable of understanding their circumstances. These are young people who have survived hardship that would break many adults. They have formed clear opinions about their situation. Those opinions deserve weight. He looked directly at Grace. Furthermore, I am troubled by certain aspects of the Reverend's petition. The original court order from Judge Harrison has been rescinded pending investigation into irregularities in his rulings. Several former placements made through the church's program have come forward with disturbing allegations that are now being examined by territorial authorities. Crawford's face went white. Mr. Garrett's methods may be unorthodox, but I find no evidence of harm to these children. On the contrary, every witness, including the children themselves, testified to improvement in their circumstances since entering his care. Judge Crane straightened in his chair. It is therefore the ruling of this court that the custody petition filed by Reverend Silas Crawford is denied. Grace couldn't breathe. The 5 minor children known as Grace Mitchell, James Mitchell, Eleanor Bell, William Reed, and Sarah shall remain in the legal guardianship of Henry Garrett. The courtroom erupted. People were cheering, crying, shouting. Crawford was on his feet, face purple with rage, but his lawyer was already pulling him toward the door. Grace felt arms around her. Her siblings, Miss Hayes, Rachel. And then Henry was there kneeling in front of them, his eyes bright with tears he wasn't quite shedding. We won, Ellie breathed. We actually won. We won, Henry confirmed. You're staying, all of you, forever. Billy launched himself at Henry, wrapping small arms around his neck. Jamie followed, then Ellie. Even Sarah moved closer, letting herself be pulled into the embrace. Grace stood apart for just a moment, watching, letting herself believe. Then Henry looked at her, held out his hand. She took it. Welcome home, he said, for real this time. 2 weeks after the trial, Sarah's heritage was officially confirmed. Henry sat with her in his study, Grace present at Sarah's request. On the desk lay the beaded necklace, the paper with Morning Star and Robert, written in faded ink, Sarah's drawing, and birth records Henry had tracked down through contacts in the Shoshone community. Sarah, Henry said carefully, I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen carefully. She nodded. My brother Robert, he had a sweetheart before he died, a Shoshone girl named Morning Star, your mother. Sarah's gray eyes widened. They loved each other. They planned to marry, to run away together to California where nobody would care about the color of their skin or the tribes of their ancestors. But Robert died in that blizzard before they could escape. Henry's voice thickened. Morning Star was pregnant. With you. Her family sent her away. Shame tradition, I don't know. She died giving birth. You were left at an orphanage by a distant relative who couldn't afford another mouth to feed. Pause. Sarah, you're not nobody from nowhere. You're my brother's daughter. You're my niece. You're my blood. Sarah processed this with 6-year-old intensity. So I do belong here. You always belonged here. Whether or not we share blood, you're mine. But we do share blood. We do. Sarah considered. Then, can I keep my name, Sarah? It's the only thing that's been mine. Of course, Sarah Garrett. If you want it. Long pause. I want it. The years that followed were marked by growth and healing. Billy stopped having nightmares. Not all at once, but gradually until whole weeks would pass without screaming and fire. He grew tall and strong, his fears replaced by fierce protectiveness of his family. By 14, he was Henry's shadow, learning everything the older man could teach. Jamie's gift with horses became legendary across the territory. The quiet boy who'd flinched at loud noises grew into a young man who could gentle the wildest stallion with patience and understanding. By 16, he was training horses for ranches across Wyoming. Ellie's first collection of stories was published when she was 19. A Denver publisher printed Tales of the West, Stories of Courage. The dedication read, "To Papa Henry, who taught me that the best stories are the ones we live." Sarah became a bridge between worlds. She split her time between the ranch and the Shoshone community, learning the language and traditions of her mother's people while embracing the heritage of her father. The silent girl who'd scared grown men with a kitchen knife became a young woman of remarkable grace and quiet power. And Grace learned to run Garrett Ranch like she'd been born to it. By 15, she could read a balance sheet and negotiate cattle prices. By 17, she was making decisions that affected the entire operation. When Rachel Bennett and Henry were married in Grace's 13th autumn, it felt less like change and more like acknowledgement of something that had always been true. Rachel didn't replace anyone. She simply expanded what family meant. The twins Robert and Rose were born 2 years later. Suddenly, there were two more Garretts in the house, and the older children discovered they had opinions about diaper changing and midnight feedings. "This is your fault," Grace told Henry one exhausted morning after walking Rose for 3 hours. "You wanted a big family. I wanted you 5. Henry took Rose from her arms, settling the infant with practiced ease. "The rest was a bonus. Besides, you loved them." Grace looked at her tiny half-sister, finally asleep. "Yeah," she admitted, "I do." The moment Grace had been dreading came on her 18th birthday. Judge Crane, now a friend and mentor, had recommended her for a position at a law firm in Denver. They would pay for her education, train her, eventually let her practice alongside them. "Sharpest mind I've seen in 40 years on the bench," he'd told them. It was everything she'd never dared to dream of. It was also been 100 miles from home. She found Henry in the barn, brushing down his favorite horse the way he always did when he needed to think. "You heard," she said. "Rachel told me. Denver's a good opportunity. I don't have to go." "Yes, you do." He stopped brushing, turned to face her. "Grace, you have been taking care of other people since you were 8 years old. First your siblings, then this whole family. It's time to take care of yourself. But the ranch has Jamie and Billy and Sarah and Rachel and me. We'll manage." His voice softened. "This is what I wanted for you, all of you. Not just survival, but life. Real life. With choices and opportunities and futures you get to build for yourselves." Grace felt tears burning behind her eyes. "What if I fail? Then you come home and we figure out something else." Henry crossed the barn, took her hands in his. "Grace Mitchell, Margaret, you are the bravest person I have ever known. You faced down men twice your size to protect your family. You testified in court against a corrupt preacher. You held this family together through things that would have broken anyone else." He squeezed her hands. "Denver doesn't stand a chance against you." She left in September. The entire family came to see her off at the train station. Henry and Rachel, Mrs. Hayes, Frank Wilson, all 4 siblings, even the twins strapped to Rachel's chest. Sarah's grandmother had sent a blessing bundle that now hung from Grace's carpet bag. Ellie cried. Billy tried not to and failed. Jamie hugged her so tight she thought her ribs might crack. Sarah pressed their foreheads together. "Come back strong. Come back soon." Henry was last. "I'm proud of you," he said quietly. "I've been proud since the moment you slapped that farmer's hand away at the auction. But today, watching you choose your own path, choose to become something more than anyone expected, this is the proudest I've ever been." "Papa," the words still felt strange even after years of practice, "I wouldn't be here without you." "Yes, you would, just somewhere different. Someone was always going to recognize what you are, Grace. I just got lucky enough to be first. The train whistle blew. Grace hugged him one last time, inhaling the scent of leather and horses and home. Then she climbed aboard, found her seat, and watched through the window as her family grew smaller and smaller until the train rounded a bend and they disappeared. She didn't cry. She was too busy imagining the future. 20 years passed like water over stone, reshaping everything slowly but completely. Grace Garrett stood in a Denver courtroom facing down a factory owner who'd been working children to death in his textile mill. At 38, she'd built a reputation as the lawyer who never backed down, never compromised, never forgot where she came from. She thought about Billy, who'd inherited the ranch and raised it to new heights. About Jamie, whose horse training operations spanned 3 states. About Ellie, famous author living in New York with a husband and 4 children. About Sarah, teaching on the reservation, building bridges between cultures. She thought about Henry now, 68, his hair white, his hands less steady, but his heart still the same. About Rachel, grandmother to 14, still running the household with quiet efficiency. About Robert and Rose, grown, now making their own marks on the world. She thought about a winter day 20 years ago, when a 10-year-old girl had stood on an auction platform and fought grown men to keep her family together. When a broken rancher had stepped out of the crowd and changed everything with 2 words. How much? The factory owner's lawyer was still talking, making arguments about profit margins and economic necessity. Grace let him finish. Then she stood. Your Honor, my opponent speaks of economic necessity, of the practical realities of running a business in this modern age. Her voice was calm, controlled, carrying. But I speak for 27 children who worked 14-hour days in conditions that would shame a prison. I speak for 3 who died because safety measures were too expensive to implement. I speak for every child who has ever been told they are less than human because they are small and powerless and have no one to fight for them. She looked at the factory owner. He flinched. My client isn't just seeking damages. She's seeking recognition. Recognition that children are people, not machinery. That their lives have value beyond the labor they can provide. That in this country, in this century, we can do better than treating our most vulnerable citizens as disposable commodities. Pause. I was an orphan once, auctioned off in a Wyoming winter to whoever would pay for me. I know what it means to be seen as merchandise. Her voice strengthened. And I know what it means to be saved by someone who refused to look away. We cannot look away, not anymore, not ever again. The verdict came back in her favor. It always did. That Christmas, Grace returned to Wyoming. The train pulled into the station at dusk, and the whole family was waiting on the platform. Gray-haired Henry leaning on Rachel's arm, Billy's children running wild, Jamie's quiet wife holding their newborn, Ellie surrounded by her boisterous brood, Sarah standing slightly apart, grandmother's blessing bundle, still on her belt after all these years. You won again, Henry said as she stepped off the train. Saw it in the papers. I learned from the best. Flattery. But he was smiling, that rare, real smile she'd learned to treasure. Come on, Mrs. Hayes' granddaughter made dinner, turkey and all the fixings. They walked together toward the wagons, 3 generations of Garretts spilling across the platform. Grace watched her family, the one she'd been born into and lost, the one she'd built from broken pieces, the one that had grown and multiplied and spread across the country like roots seeking water. In the wagon heading home through snow, she slipped her hand into Henry's weathered one. Papa, yes, thank you for stepping forward, for not walking away. Henry squeezed her hand, his gray eyes still kind met hers. Thank you for letting me. And Grace May Garrett, who had once stood on an auction platform and whispered that nobody wanted her, finally understood the truth that had been waiting for her all along. She had never been unwanted. She had simply been waiting for the right person to see her worth. And when he came, he didn't just save her life. He gave her the courage to build one worth living. That was the gift Henry Garrett had given 5 broken children on a winter day in Wyoming. Not just a home, not just a name, but the unshakable knowledge that they mattered, that they belonged, that somewhere in this vast and often cruel world there was a place for them, a family, forever. Epilogue. Winter 1902. Final night. The fire had burned down to embers. Outside, the Wyoming night was silent and still. Inside the study, Grace and Will sat in comfortable quiet, the story finally complete. That's it, Will asked after a long moment. You just lived happily ever after. Grace laughed soft and genuine. No, child, life is never that simple. There were hard years, drought and disease and all the thousand small struggles that come with living. Henry died when I was 45. Rachel followed him 6 years later. We buried them on the hill overlooking the ranch where they could see everything they'd built. She stood joints protesting. But we survived. We thrived. Because he taught us how. Not just how to run a ranch or argue a case or train a horse. He taught us how to be family, how to fight for each other, how to build something that lasts. Will stood too taller now somehow, or maybe just standing straighter. I'm not scared anymore, grandmother. Good, you shouldn't be. You're a Garrett. We don't scare easy. She placed a hand on his shoulder. Go to Boston, study law, fight for people who can't fight for themselves. And when it gets hard, when you're tired and scared and wondering if you're strong enough, remember. She squeezed his shoulder. You come from a line of fighters, from a girl who stood on an auction platform and refused to let her family be torn apart, from a man who saw broken children and chose to love them anyway, from 5 kids who survived things that should have destroyed them and built lives worth living. You're strong enough, Will. You always were. The boy, almost a man, now hugged his grandmother tight. Thank you for telling me, for helping me understand. That's what family does. We tell the stories. We pass down the lessons. We make sure nobody forgets where we came from or what it cost to get here. Grace watched him go climbing the stairs to finally pack that trunk for real this time. She stood alone by the dying fire, 60 years old, and tired down to her bones, but satisfied. The story had been told. The lessons passed on. Another generation prepared to carry the weight. Somewhere in the house she heard movement. Henry's son Robert checking the livestock before bed. Rose's voice reading into her own children. The next generation growing, learning, becoming. And Grace thought about that February day in 1872 when everything changed. About a 10-year-old girl and a 40-year-old man, and the family they built from nothing but determination and stubborn, fierce, unbreakable love. About how sometimes the bravest thing you can do is accept help when it's offered. About how trust once broken can be rebuilt stronger than before. About how family isn't always blood, but blood doesn't hurt. About how some loves last forever. And about how the best revenge against a world that tried to break you is to build something beautiful from the pieces. Outside, snow began to fall again over Garrett Ranch. Inside, the fires burned and the children slept, and Grace Garrett smiled, knowing that 30 years ago, on a platform in the snow, she'd made the right choice. She'd taken a stranger's hand and found her way home.